Wayne Carter chose a crowded ballroom to end his marriage. Crystal chandeliers hung above 100 silent witnesses as he slid a thin folder across the table toward his wife. "Sign it," he said calmly. "You were never really part of my world, Mallory." A few people laughed under their breath. Lydia Monroe stood beside him, elegant, confident, already occupying the place Mallory once had. Wayne Carter believed he was divorcing a quiet, insignificant woman. What he didn't know was that the last name Mallory rarely spoke aloud, Westbrook had built more skyscrapers in the city than his company ever would. And tonight, he had just humiliated the daughter of a real estate empire. Before the story continues, take a moment and tell me where you're watching from and what your local time is right now. Stories like this travel across cities and time zones, and it's always fascinating to see how far they reach. If you believe dignity matters more than arrogance, and that quiet people are often the ones others underestimate the most, consider subscribing to the channel so you won't miss the rest of this story. Mallory's silence tonight is only the beginning. Long before the night Wayne Carter slid divorce papers across a table in a ballroom full of investors, Mallory Westbrook had already learned a quiet rule about people. Those who spoke the loudest about power usually understood it the least. She rarely corrected them. Most people who met Mallory assumed she had grown up ordinary. The assumption came easily. She dressed simply. She drove a practical car. She worked behind the scenes in offices where other people chased recognition. In Chicago, where reputation and real estate often moved together, the Carter name had begun to rise quickly in recent years. Wayne Carter, founder of Carter Development, had positioned himself carefully among Mallory first met Wayne in a place far less glamorous than the ballroom where he would eventually humiliate her. She worked as an administrative coordinator for Carter Development during the company's earlier days, when its office was still cramped and its future uncertain. Her desk sat near the operations team, close enough to hear phone calls with contractors, architects, and city officials. Mallory's work rarely attracted attention, but it kept the company organized. She managed schedules, maintained contracts, archived emails, and quietly corrected mistakes before they reached Wayne's desk. Wayne noticed her because problems seemed to disappear around her. At first, he admired that. Wayne Carter had always been a man who moved forward aggressively. His confidence came easily. His charm came easily too, especially when investors were watching. He had the kind of presence that filled rooms, and he knew exactly how to use it. Mallory was different. Where Wayne talked, Mallory listened. Where Wayne projected certainty, Mallory observed details others ignored. When Wayne asked her to dinner but he was persistent. And in those early days, he seemed genuinely grateful for her help. He told her she understood the company better than anyone else. He said he trusted her judgment. Trust was a word Mallory valued carefully. The relationship grew quickly. Wayne liked how calm she was. She didn't compete with him socially. She didn't challenge his authority in public. Investors often commented that she made him appear grounded. To Wayne, that was an advantage. Within a year, they were married. The ceremony was modest compared to the lavish events Wayne would later attend. It took place in a quiet chapel outside the city, attended mostly by a few relatives from Wayne's side and several colleagues from the company. Mallory's family presence was noticeably small. Only one person stood beside her during the ceremony, her aunt Helen Westbrook. Helen was a composed woman in her late 60s who spoke little but watched everything with careful eyes. She had raised Mallory after Mallory's mother passed away years earlier. When Wayne asked about the rest of Mallory's family, the explanation had been simple. "They're not really involved in my life," Mallory said. Wayne accepted that answer easily. At the time, it made things simpler. Without powerful relatives or complicated family ties, Mallory appeared uncomplicated. She belonged entirely to the life Wayne was building, or so he believed. In the early years of the marriage, their life followed the rhythm of Wayne's growing business. Carter Development began winning contracts for mid-rise residential projects across Chicago's expanding neighborhoods. With each project, Wayne's confidence grew. The company moved into a larger office downtown. Wayne began attending investor dinners and industry conferences. His name started appearing in local business magazines. Mallory remained largely invisible within that rising reputation. She continued managing the company's internal organization, though officially she was no longer an employee. Wayne preferred to present his leadership as independent, built through his own vision. Mallory did not argue. But she continued doing the same work she had always done. Tracking documents, reviewing contracts, keeping records. She developed habits that most people never noticed. Every email was archived. Every financial report was copied. Every meeting summary was stored with time and date. These habits came naturally to her. Organization gave her clarity, and clarity gave her peace. Wayne never questioned it. He trusted that Mallory's quiet efficiency simply kept his world running smoothly. Over time, however, the Carter family began noticing something else about her. Wayne's mother, Margaret Carter, had always believed her son deserved a wife who reflected his rising status. Margaret came from a family that valued social connections almost as much as wealth itself. Mallory did not participate in that world. She rarely spoke during large gatherings. She declined invitations to social clubs. She seemed uninterested in the kind of public visibility Margaret believed essential for successful families. During one family dinner, Margaret made her opinion clear. "You're very quiet, Mallory," she said, folding her napkin neatly. "In this industry, visibility matters." Mallory nodded politely. "I prefer listening," she replied. Margaret exchanged a glance with her husband, Thomas Carter. Neither of them understood that answer. From their perspective, Mallory lacked ambition. She had no visible career, no influential family connections, no public presence that enhanced Wayne's reputation. What they saw was a woman who had simply attached herself to Wayne's success. Wayne rarely corrected them. At first, he defended Mallory gently. "She helps more than you realize," he told his parents once. But as Carter development grew larger, Wayne began spending less time explaining Mallory's role to anyone. Explaining required acknowledging it, and acknowledging it complicated the image he was beginning to cultivate. Investors preferred clear stories. They liked founders who appeared self-made, driven by individual vision. Wayne fit that image perfectly. Mallory, quiet and unseen, faded easily from the narrative. Years passed this way. Carter development expanded into larger projects. Wayne began working with marketing consultants who specialized in branding executives as public figures within the real estate industry. One of those consultants would eventually change everything. Her name was Lydia Monroe. But Mallory first noticed the shift long before Lydia formally entered Wayne's professional circle. She noticed it in the tone of his voice after certain meetings, in the late nights at the office, in the increasing number of networking events where Wayne attended alone. When she asked about them, Wayne's answers were brief. "Investor dinners," he said. "Strategy meetings." Mallory never pushed for explanations. Instead, she continued observing. By then, her system of records had grown extensive. It contained years of emails, expense reports, and internal communications from Carter development. Not because she distrusted Wayne, but because she believed something simple truth often revealed itself through patterns. And patterns, once recorded carefully enough, rarely stayed hidden forever. Wayne Carter never imagined that Mallory's quiet habits would matter. He saw her silence as passivity. He saw her patience as dependence. He saw her lack of self-promotion as weakness. Those assumptions would eventually shape every decision he made about their marriage. What Wayne never realized was that Mallory's silence did not come from uncertainty. It came from restraint. And restraint, when paired with careful observation, had a way of surviving long after arrogance collapsed. The night Wayne publicly handed her divorce papers in that ballroom, many people believed they were witnessing the end of Mallory's place in his life. But the truth had begun unfolding much earlier, quietly and visibly inside folders of emails and records that Mallory had been preserving for years. Wayne Carter thought he understood the woman he had married. In reality, he had only understood the version of her that never needed to speak. And the moment he decided to erase her from his life was the same moment he unknowingly stepped into a story that would expose far more than a broken marriage. It would expose the cost of underestimating someone who had been watching all along. In Chicago's real estate world, appearances were rarely accidental. Every reception, every charity gala, every investor dinner carried quiet calculations beneath the polished surface. Partnerships formed over champagne glasses. Deals were hinted at in casual conversations. Reputations rose and fell depending on who stood beside whom. The charity event that would later become Mallory Westbrook's first public humiliation was exactly that kind of evening. It was hosted at the Lakefront Heritage Hotel, a place where Chicago's real estate developers, investment bankers, and city officials gathered twice a year to raise funds for urban housing initiatives. The event had become a ritual for those who built the city's skyline. Wayne Carter had been looking forward to this particular night for weeks. Carter Development had recently secured preliminary approval for a large mixed-use project in the Fulton Market District. The deal was not final yet, but Wayne understood how influence worked in rooms like this. Visibility mattered. Being seen with the right people mattered even more. Mallory noticed the difference in his mood days before the event. Wayne was energetic, restless, constantly checking messages. His phone buzzed throughout dinner conversations, and he often stepped away to take calls. When Mallory asked about the event preparations, Wayne gave short answers. "Just investors," he said. "You don't need to worry about it." But Mallory still attended. As Wayne's wife, her presence was expected. She prepared the way she always did, simply. A dark blue dress, understated jewelry, hair neatly tied back. She understood the environment well enough to know that subtlety often drew less attention than elaborate attempts at glamour. The ballroom at the Lakefront Heritage Hotel has glowed with soft lighting and glass chandeliers that reflected across polished marble floors. Conversations filled the air in controlled waves, punctuated by the occasional laughter of people who understood one another's status. Mallory stood beside Wayne near the entrance as guests arrived. For the first 30 minutes, things followed the pattern she had grown accustomed to over the years. Wayne greeted investors. He shook hands with city officials. He spoke confidently about Carter Development's upcoming projects. Mallory stood nearby, smiling politely when introduced, speaking briefly when addressed. Many guests barely registered her presence. That too was familiar. What changed the rhythm of the evening arrived shortly after 8 o'clock. Mallory noticed her before Wayne introduced her. The woman entering the ballroom moved with a kind of practiced ease that suggested she was used to being noticed. She wore a pale silver dress that caught the light as she walked. Her posture was straight, her expression warm, and she greeted several guests as if she already belonged among them. Mallory recognized her immediately. Lydia Monroe. The name had appeared in Wayne's emails months earlier, attached to proposals for brand consulting and media strategy. Lydia specialized in shaping public identities for executives whose companies were beginning to grow. Wayne had described her work once at dinner. "She's good with media," he had said. "Helps position developers as thought leaders." Mallory had not asked many questions. Now Lydia Monroe approached them directly. "Wayne," Lydia said, with a bright smile extending her hand. Wayne's expression changed instantly. His posture straightened slightly, and the enthusiasm in his voice carried farther than usual. "Lydia," he replied. "Glad you made it." The introduction that followed was brief. "Mallory, this is Lydia Monroe," Wayne said. "She's helping us with our branding strategy." Mallory nodded politely. "Nice to meet you," she said. Lydia's handshake was firm and professional, but her eyes lingered on Wayne longer than necessary. It was a subtle gesture, something most people in the room would never notice. Mallory noticed. As the evening continued, Lydia remained close to Wayne. At first, the proximity seemed professional. They discussed marketing ideas with investors. Lydia spoke confidently about how Carter Development could expand its public profile. Mallory listened quietly as she stood slightly behind them. Several times, Wayne introduced Lydia to new contacts without mentioning Mallory at all. Instead, he described Lydia's role enthusiastically. "She's helping bring Carter development to the next level," he said more than once. Mallory noticed the pattern forming. The introductions changed gradually. Where Wayne once presented Mallory as his wife during these events, now he simply nodded toward her when necessary. Eventually, during a conversation with two potential investors, Wayne said something that caused the first quiet shift in the room's atmosphere. One of the investors, an older man named Charles Donovan, glanced toward Mallory and asked politely, "And what do you do within the company, Mrs. Carter?" Before Mallory could answer, Wayne responded, "Oh, Mallory doesn't really get involved with the business side," he said lightly. The tone was casual, almost joking. "She prefers staying out of all this." A few people chuckled politely. Mallory remained still. The investor nodded, accepting the explanation without further curiosity. But something in the exchange lingered. Later in the evening, during a conversation near the bars, Wayne repeated a similar remark to a different group. "Mallory keeps me grounded," he said. "But the strategy side, that's more Lydia's territory." Again, the comment sounded harmless to anyone not paying close attention. Mallory noticed Lydia's smile each time Wayne said it. By the time dinner was served, Lydia had effectively taken Mallory's place beside Wayne in most conversations. Guests began directing business questions toward Lydia instead of Mallory. Wayne seemed comfortable with the shift. Mallory sat quietly through the meal. She spoke when spoken to. She listened. She observed. One moment in particular stayed with her. A young developer seated across the table complimented Wayne's rapid success. "You've built something impressive," he said. Wayne leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying the recognition. "Timing helps," he replied. Then he gestured toward Lydia. "And having the right people around." Lydia smiled again. Mallory lowered her gaze to her plate. No one commented on the omission. As the event continued, the conversations around them grew louder. Investors exchanged ideas about upcoming projects. Several guests discussed zoning changes in the city's western districts. Mallory gradually stepped away from the central crowd. She moved toward one of the tall windows overlooking Lake Michigan, where the noise softened into distant murmurs. From that position, she could still see Wayne across the ballroom. He stood beside Lydia, laughing at something she had said. His hand rested lightly on Lydia's arm as he spoke. It was a small gesture, but it lasted long enough. Mallory did not interrupt them. She did not confront him. Instead, she quietly opened her phone and checked the time. 9:37 p.m. Later that night, after the event ended and they returned home, Wayne seemed energized. "Good turnout tonight," he said while loosening his tie. Mallory nodded. "Yes," she replied. Wayne poured himself a drink. "Lydia's ideas are going to help the company," he added. "We need stronger media positioning." Mallory did not disagree. But when Wayne left the room to answer a phone call, she walked into the small office space in their home. She opened her laptop. The system she had built over the years still waited there. Folders organized by date project and communication records. For the first time, she created a new category. She labeled it simply Monroe. Then she began moving certain emails into it. Not many, just the ones that showed small patterns. Consulting invoices, meeting schedules, expense reimbursements. Tiny details most people would ignore. Mallory did not know yet what those patterns would eventually reveal. But she had learned long ago that patterns, once they began forming, rarely stopped on their own. Across the hallway, Wayne Carter laughed into his phone as he spoke with Lydia Monroe about the success of the evening. Neither of them realized that the quiet woman in the next room had just begun documenting the first chapter of a story that would one day dismantle everything they were building together. The weeks following the charity gala passed with an unusual quiet in the Carter household. Not the peaceful kind of quiet that settles naturally into long marriages, but a quieter tension that existed between words. Wayne spoke less during dinners. He often answered messages during conversations. His schedule, once shared openly with Mallory, began to change without explanation. Mallory did not question him immediately. Instead, she continued doing what she had always done best, observing. The system she maintained on her laptop had grown steadily over the years. What had once been simple folders of company communications had gradually expanded into a carefully structured archive. Emails, calendar entries, internal reports, meeting notes, and expense summaries were stored chronologically, each labeled and cross-referenced. Mallory never described it as an investigation. To her, it was simply organization. Still, patterns had begun to appear. One of the first came from the company expense reports Wayne sometimes forwarded to their home email account when working late. Mallory noticed the name Monroe appearing more frequently in the reimbursement descriptions. Consulting fees, travel expenses, marketing consultations. None of those categories seemed unusual on their own. Lydia Monroe had been hired to help Carter Development expand its public profile. The invoices, at least on the surface, appeared legitimate. But the frequency of the payments caught Mallory's attention. Some invoices arrived twice within the same week. Others were approved unusually quickly. Mallory opened the company ledger Wayne had once asked her to review during the early years of the business. Though she no longer worked formally at Carter Development, she still retained access to certain archived files. The numbers themselves were not alarming. What interested her was the timeline. Many of Lydia's consulting charges aligned precisely with evenings Wayne claimed to be attending investor meetings. Mallory made a note of the dates. She added them to the folder labeled Monroe. Then she continued reviewing. 2 days later, another detail appeared. While organizing bank statements from their joint account, Mallory noticed a series of payments to a boutique hotel downtown. The charges were not extravagant $200 here, $300 there, but they appeared repeatedly on nights Wayne said he had been working late. Mallory stared at the screen for several seconds. The explanation could still be innocent. Business meetings sometimes required private conference spaces. Investors occasionally preferred quieter environments than crowded restaurants. But again, the pattern repeated too often. She copied the transaction records into her archive. Mallory did not confront Wayne that night. Instead, she waited. Waiting had always been easier for her than reacting. 3 evenings later, the opportunity to ask arrived naturally. They were eating dinner at home, the television playing quietly in the background. Wayne had returned from the office later than usual. Mallory poured him a glass of water. "You've been busy lately," she said calmly. Wayne nodded, barely looking up from his phone. "Expansion plans," he replied. "A lot happening right now." Mallory sat across from him. "I noticed Lydia's consulting work has increased," she added. Wayne's expression tightened slightly. "It's normal," he said. "We're building the company's brand." Mallory studied his face for a moment. "The invoices seem frequent," she said. Wayne placed his phone on the table. "You're looking through company expenses now?" he asked. The tone carried mild irritation. Mallory remained calm. "You used to ask me to review them," she replied. That was before Wayne said quickly, "The company's different now." His voice sharpened. "You wouldn't really understand the level we're operating on." The sentence lingered in the air between them. Mallory did not respond immediately. Instead, she nodded slowly. "I see," she said. Wayne picked up his phone again. The conversation ended there. Later that night, after Wayne had gone to sleep, Mallory returned to the small office room. The house was silent, except for the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. She opened her laptop and continued reviewing documents. Another email thread appeared, one she had overlooked earlier. It was between Wayne and Lydia Monroe. The subject line read, "Media Strategy Session." Most of the messages discussed marketing plans, interview opportunities, and public appearances for Carter Development. But one message stood out. Wayne had written it late at night, nearly midnight. "Let's use the same hotel as last time. It's quieter." Mallory read the sentence again. There was nothing explicitly inappropriate about it. But combined with the payment records she had already seen, the message felt heavier. She added the email to the Monroe folder. For the next hour, Mallory worked methodically. She cross-referenced calendar entries with bank statements. She compared travel reimbursements with meeting schedules. Gradually, a more detailed picture began forming. Some meetings, Wayne claimed, were with investors, had no corresponding business expenses. Others matched perfectly with Lydia's consulting invoices. Mallory did not draw conclusions yet. She simply recorded. Across the city, Carter Development continued gaining recognition. Articles began appearing in local business publications, praising Wayne Carter as one of Chicago's rising developers. Lydia Monroe's media strategy seemed effective. Mallory read those articles quietly each morning. In the photographs accompanying them, Lydia often stood beside Wayne during interviews. Mallory's name rarely appeared. That absence did not surprise her. What surprised her more was how comfortable Wayne seemed with it. A week later, during a Sunday visit to Wayne's parents, the tension surfaced again. Margaret Carter poured coffee for everyone at the dining table. "So Wayne tells us Lydia Monroe is doing excellent work," Margaret said. Wayne nodded approvingly. "She understands the industry," he said. Margaret glanced briefly at Mallory. "That's important," she replied, "especially when a company starts attracting serious attention." The implication was subtle, but unmistakable. Mallory stirred her coffee slowly. Thomas Carter cleared his throat. "Public image matters now," he added. "Investors like seeing strong teams." Margaret smiled slightly. "Some wives are very good at representing their husband's success," she said. Mallory understood the message perfectly. Margaret believed Lydia Monroe represented Wayne's professional world more effectively than she did. Wayne did not correct his mother. Instead, he changed the subject to a new development project. Mallory listened quietly for the rest of the visit. That evening, after they returned home, Wayne prepared to leave again. "Investor meeting," he said while putting on his jacket. Mallory nodded. "What time will you be back?" she asked. "Late." The door closed behind him. Mallory waited 15 minutes. Then she opened her laptop once more. Her system had grown more detailed over the past weeks. Now it included not only financial records and emails, but also notes about conversations and dates. She added one more entry. Sunday, 8:42 p.m. Wayne left for investor meeting. Then she opened the bank records again. If the pattern continued, a hotel charge would appear the following morning. Mallory closed the laptop after finishing the entry. She did not feel anger, not yet. What she felt instead was something quieter clarity. The same kind of clarity she had relied on her entire life whenever uncertainty appeared. Truth, she believed, rarely revealed itself through dramatic confrontations. It revealed itself through accumulation. Details, patterns, records. And Mallory Westbrook had always been very good at keeping records. Across the city that night, Wayne Carter believed he was building a future that no longer included his wife. What he did not realize was that every careless step he took toward that future was leaving a trail. And Mallory had already begun following it. In the months that followed, Lydia Monroe's presence in Wayne Carter's life became less subtle. At first, it was framed as business necessity. Carter Development was expanding. Wayne was appearing more frequently in interviews, panel discussions, and industry publications. Lydia, as his media strategist, often stood beside him during those appearances. The explanation sounded professional. Most people accepted it easily. But inside the Carter household, the changes were impossible to ignore. Wayne's schedule began shifting around Lydia's availability. Evening meetings appeared more frequently on his calendar. Business dinners extended late into the night. Some weekends that once belonged to quiet mornings at home were suddenly filled with branding strategy sessions. Mallory did not confront him about these changes. Instead, she continued observing the patterns that had already begun forming in her records. By now, the folder labeled Monroe had grown thicker. Emails, calendar entries, expense reports. Each piece of information remained small on its own. None of it proved anything conclusively. But together, they formed a rhythm that no longer resembled ordinary consulting work. One evening in early autumn, Wayne hosted a small dinner at their home. Several colleagues from Carter Development attended along with 2 investors interested in a new residential project. Lydia Monroe arrived as well, carrying a bottle of wine and a bright, effortless smile. Mallory greeted her politely at the door. "Good to see you again," Lydia said warmly. "You too," Mallory replied. Throughout the evening, Lydia moved through the house comfortably speaking with guests, as if she had hosted similar gatherings many times before. Wayne rarely left her side. They discussed marketing strategies near the kitchen counter, while investors listened with interest. Lydia described future media opportunities for Wayne, explaining how his image could expand beyond local development circles into national real estate commentary. "You have the right story," she told him confidently. "Self-made developer building communities in Chicago. People respond to that." Wayne nodded. "That's exactly the narrative we want," he said. Mallory noticed the word narrative. Narratives required careful editing. Later during dinner, one of the investors asked Wayne how he balanced work and personal life while managing such rapid growth. Wayne laughed lightly. "You make time where you can," he replied. Then he gestured vaguely toward Mallory. "My wife prefers staying away from all the business chaos." The table chuckled politely. Lydia smiled. Mallory lowered her eyes to her plate. After the guests left that night, the house fell quiet again. Wayne remained energized from the evening's conversations. "Lydia's ideas are going to help us expand nationally," he said while pouring himself a drink in the kitchen. Mallory rinsed dishes in the sink. "She seems confident," Mallory replied. Wayne nodded. "She understands how to position people like me." The phrase lingered briefly in the air. People like me. Mallory dried her hands with a towel. "And what does that mean?" she asked gently. Wayne shrugged. "Developers who are going somewhere." Mallory studied him for a moment. "You've always been ambitious," she said. Wayne smiled. "That's why the company's growing." Mallory did not argue. But later that night, after Wayne had gone upstairs, she returned to the office room once more. The folder labeled Monroe now included several months of documentation. Tonight she added new notes from the dinner conversation. Narrative building, public image positioning. Mallory paused for a moment before typing the next line. Mallory's role increasingly minimized during public interactions. She closed the file and leaned back in her chair. The pieces of the pattern were no longer forming slowly. They were accelerating. 2 weeks later, another family dinner took place at Wayne's parents' house. Margaret Carter had invited several relatives to celebrate Wayne's recent recognition in a regional business magazine. A framed copy of the article sat prominently on the living room table. The headline read, "Wayne Carter, Chicago's next major developer." Mallory noticed immediately that the article mentioned Lydia Monroe twice. Her own name did not appear at all. Margaret handed Wayne a glass of wine proudly. "We're all very proud of you," she said. Thomas Carter nodded approvingly. "You built something impressive." Margaret turned toward Lydia, who had also been invited to the dinner. "And Lydia," she said warmly, "you've clearly been helping Wayne shape the right image." Lydia smiled politely. "I just helped tell the story," she replied. Margaret glanced briefly toward Mallory. "Some people are better suited for that world than others," she said. The comment was delivered calmly, but its meaning was unmistakable. Mallory remained composed. Wayne did not intervene. Instead, he changed the subject to the Fulton Market project, describing potential investors and construction timelines. Throughout the conversation, Lydia contributed ideas, confidently occasionally finishing Wayne's sentences when discussing marketing strategy. Mallory watched quietly. From the outside, the dynamic already resembled something closer than professional collaboration. Yet no one in the room spoke of it directly. On the drive home that night, the silence in the car stretched longer than usual. Finally, Mallory spoke. "Your mother seems to admire Lydia." Wayne kept his eyes on the road. "She respects competence," he replied. Mallory nodded slightly. "Does she think I'm incompetent?" Wayne sighed. "You're taking it personally." Mallory waited. Wayne continued. "It's just, Lydia understands the industry better." The statement was delivered casually, but it carried weight. Mallory turned toward the window, watching the city lights slide past in the darkness. "I see," she said quietly. Wayne did not elaborate further. That night, after Wayne fell asleep, Mallory once again opened her laptop. Her documentation system had now evolved into something more structured than simple organization. She began building timelines. Dates of Lydia's consulting invoices, dates of hotel charges, dates of public events where Lydia appeared beside Wayne. Gradually, those timelines overlapped in ways that became difficult to ignore. One email she discovered late that night stood apart from the others. It was brief, sent from Wayne's personal account to Lydia. "Once everything is finalized, things will be simpler." There was no direct reference to divorce. But the meaning behind the words felt unmistakable. Mallory saved the email carefully. She did not react emotionally. She simply added the file to the growing archive. Across the city, Wayne Carter believed he was slowly transitioning his life into a new phase one, where Mallory would quietly fade into the background. What he did not understand was that Mallory was not fading. She was documenting. And every message, every transaction, every careless word Wayne left behind was quietly assembling a record of the story he believed no one else could see. The conversation about divorce did not arrive with shouting. It arrived the way many of Wayne Carter's decisions did, quietly prepared, carefully timed, and presented as if the outcome had already been decided. Mallory sensed something shifting weeks before Wayne finally spoke the words. His behavior had grown more distant, but it was not the cold anger of a failing marriage. It was something more calculated. He spoke to her politely, even kindly at times, yet his tone carried a subtle finality, as though their shared life had already become a chapter he was preparing to close. The moment came on a Tuesday evening. Wayne asked Mallory to meet him in the small conference room at Carter Development's downtown office. The request itself felt unusual. Wayne rarely involved her in business meetings anymore. When Mallory arrived, the room already held two other people. One was Wayne. The other was a man Mallory recognized immediately from legal documents she had seen before, Greg Whitman. Whitman had served as outside counsel for Carter Development during several property acquisitions. He was a precise man in his early 50s, known for his calm demeanor and meticulous paperwork. A thin stack of documents lay on the table between them. Wayne stood when Mallory entered. "Thanks for coming," he said. Mallory took a seat across from them. Greg Whitman nodded politely. "Mrs. Carter," he said. Mallory returned the greeting quietly. The atmosphere in the room felt oddly formal. Wayne cleared his throat. "I wanted to discuss something important," he began. Mallory waited. Wayne glanced briefly at Greg Whitman, then back at Mallory. "I think it would be better for both of us if we ended the marriage." The sentence landed in the room without drama. Mallory did not react immediately. Wayne continued speaking before she could. "It's not about anger," he said quickly. "Sometimes people grow in different directions." Mallory studied his face. Behind Wayne's composed expression, she noticed something else: impatience. He wanted the conversation to move quickly. Greg Whitman slid the folder toward her. "We've prepared a separation agreement," the lawyer said calmly. Mallory looked down at the documents, but did not open them yet. Wayne leaned forward slightly. "This will make things simple," he said. "You'll receive a settlement payment, enough to start over comfortably." Mallory finally opened the folder. The pages inside were organized neatly, printed on heavy paper. She read the numbers first. The settlement amount was modest compared to the scale of Carter Development's current projects. It was enough to live quietly for several years, but it reflected none of the wealth Wayne's company now claimed. More notable than the financial terms was another section: non-disclosure agreement. Mallory read the clause carefully. She would be required to refrain from discussing Wayne's personal life, his business dealings, and any internal company matters. The language was broad. Greg Whitman spoke again. The agreement protects both parties' privacy, he explained. Mallory turned another page. A deadline had been written into the document. 7 days. Wayne watched her as she read. "This is fair," he said. Mallory looked up slowly. "Fair for whom?" she asked. Wayne sighed softly. "For both of us," he replied. "You'll have financial security and the company avoids unnecessary complications." The phrasing revealed more than he likely intended. The company avoids complications. Mallory closed the folder gently. "You've already made your decision," she said. Wayne nodded. "I think it's the best path forward." Mallory rested her hands on the table. "For you," she said. Wayne's patience thinned slightly. "Mallory, let's be realistic." He gestured lightly toward the documents. "The company is growing. My life is changing. This arrangement gives you a clean transition." Mallory noticed the word transition. Transitions implied movement. Yet Wayne had prepared everything in advance. Greg Whitman spoke carefully. "You're welcome to review the agreement with independent counsel," he said. Mallory met his eyes. "Do you expect me to sign today?" she asked. Wayne shook his head. "No," he said. "Take a few days." His tone softened slightly. "I'm not trying to make this harder than it needs to be." Mallory stood slowly holding the folder. "I'll review it," she said. Wayne nodded, relieved the meeting had remained calm. As Mallory turned toward the door, Wayne added one more sentence. "I think you'll realize this is the most practical solution." Mallory paused briefly. Then she left the room. The hallway outside Carter Development's conference rooms was quiet at that hour. Office lights reflected softly against the glass walls. Mallory walked slowly toward the elevator. Her reflection followed her in the polished surfaces. Inside the elevator, she opened the folder again. The settlement terms appeared even clearer under the bright overhead light. A modest payment, a strict non-disclosure clause, a rapid timeline. Wayne Carter had prepared the exit of his wife the same way he prepared business contracts. Efficient, contained, controlled. Mallory closed the folder as the elevator reached the ground floor. Outside, Chicago's evening air carried the distant sounds of traffic along the river. She walked toward her car without rushing. Inside the vehicle, she placed the folder carefully on the passenger seat. For several minutes, she did not start the engine. Instead, she stared at the documents again, not with anger, but with calculation. The pattern she had been documenting for months now made clearer sense. Wayne wanted to remove her quietly, before the next stage of his life began, before certain questions could be asked, before certain records might become inconvenient. Mallory started the car. That night after Wayne returned home, he behaved as if the difficult conversation had already passed. He asked politely if she'd eaten dinner. He poured himself a drink and watched television. Mallory placed the folder on the kitchen counter. "You're confident about this decision," she said. Wayne nodded. "Yes?" Mallory studied him. "You're certain there's nothing else influencing it?" Wayne met her gaze briefly. "No," he said. The answer arrived too quickly. Mallory picked up the folder again. "I'll take some time to review it," she said. Wayne seemed satisfied with that response. "Good," he replied. Later that night, after Wayne had gone upstairs, Mallory returned to the office room. The laptop screen glowed softly in the dark. She opened the folder labeled Monroe. Then she created another. She named it simply Divorce. Inside it, she saved a scanned copy of the settlement agreement. Then she began cross-referencing the timeline once again. Dates of hotel charges, dates of Lydia's consulting invoices, dates of Wayne's email messages. Now she added another line. Divorce proposal Tuesday, 6:15 p.m. Mallory leaned back in her chair. For the first time since Wayne had spoken the word divorce, a new understanding settled quietly in her mind. Wayne Carter believed he was removing a complication from his life. What he did not realize was that he had just created a legal moment. A moment where every record Mallory had preserved might eventually matter. And Mallory Westbrook had never been careless with records. For 3 days after Wayne Carter handed her the divorce agreement, Mallory Westbrook said almost nothing about it. The silence did not trouble Wayne. In fact, it reassured him. He interpreted her quietness the same way he always had, as resignation. Mallory had never been confrontational, never raised her voice during arguments, never demanded explanations when he returned home late. To Wayne, her calm acceptance of the situation seemed consistent with the woman he believed he knew. He assumed she would eventually sign. Mallory spent those 3 days doing something else entirely. She organized. The office room in their home had gradually transformed into a place where the past several years of their lives were stored in careful digital order. The folders she maintained now held thousands of files. Emails, contracts, financial summaries, meeting schedules, and notes she had written after conversations. The new folder, labeled Divorce, now sat beside the older one, labeled Monroe. Inside the divorce folder, Mallory began building a separate timeline. She documented everything from the moment Wayne had first mentioned Lydia Monroe months earlier through the changes in his schedule, the hotel charges, the consulting invoices, and now the formal divorce proposal. Each entry included the date, the time when possible, and the source of the information. Mallory did not yet know exactly how the timeline would be used. But she understood one important principle: clarity mattered in legal matters. And clarity required evidence. On the 4th morning after the meeting with Greg Whitman, something unexpected arrived. Mallory was sitting at the kitchen table reviewing the divorce agreement again when the doorbell rang. She was not expecting anyone. When she opened the door, she found a woman standing on the porch who looked to be in her early 70s. Her posture was straight despite her age, and she carried a small leather briefcase. Mallory recognized her immediately. "Eleanor Pierce," Mallory said quietly. The older woman smiled gently. "It's been a long time, Mallory." Mallory stepped aside. "Please come in." Eleanor Pierce entered the house, slowly glancing around the living room, as if measuring the years that had passed since she last saw the young woman who now stood before her. Eleanor had once been a frequent presence during Mallory's childhood. She was a lawyer, one who had worked for the Westbrook family for decades. Mallory had not seen her since shortly after her mother's funeral. They sat across from each other at the dining table. Eleanor placed her briefcase carefully on the table but did not open it immediately. "I heard about the divorce," she said calmly. Mallory's eyebrows lifted slightly, from whom Eleanor smiled faintly. "The legal world tends to talk," she replied. Mallory considered the answer. Wayne had hired Greg Whitman to prepare the agreement. Whitman worked within the same legal networks that Eleanor Pierce had been part of for decades. News traveled quickly among lawyers who specialized in real estate and corporate matters. "You came because of the divorce?" Mallory asked. "Partly," Eleanor said. She studied Mallory for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "You've grown into someone very much like your mother." Mallory looked down briefly. "My mother didn't talk much either," she said. Eleanor nodded. She observed. There was a pause between them. Finally, Eleanor opened the briefcase. Inside were several documents. Not divorce papers, not financial reports. These documents looked older. Some of them carried legal seals. Eleanor placed one folder on the table and slid it toward Mallory. "You should read this," she said. Mallory opened it slowly. The first page contained a name she had not seen formally written in years. Richard Westbrook, her father. Mallory had grown up knowing that name, but it had rarely been discussed in detail. After her mother's death, most conversations about Richard Westbrook had quietly stopped. Mallory had been raised instead by her Aunt Helen. The explanation she received as a child had always been simple. Her father was busy, very busy. But the document in front of her described something far more specific. Richard Westbrook was not simply a businessman. He was the founder of Westbrook Holdings, one of the largest privately held real estate development groups operating across several American cities. Mallory read the words slowly. The company name was familiar. Anyone involved in real estate recognized it. Westbrook Holdings owned large sections of commercial property in Chicago, Dallas, and several East Coast cities. But Mallory had never connected that empire directly to her own life. She looked up at Eleanor. "Why are you showing me this now?" Eleanor folded her hands. "Because your father asked me to." Mallory's expression remained calm, but something shifted quietly in her eyes. "My father hasn't spoken to me in years. That was his choice," Eleanor replied carefully. And now Eleanor glanced briefly at the divorce agreement lying on the kitchen counter. Now the circumstances have changed. Mallory closed the folder slowly. "What circumstances?" Eleanor met her gaze directly. "Your father always intended to protect you from the business world he built," she said. Mallory remained silent. Eleanor continued. "When your mother died, there were complicated legal matters involving inheritance and corporate control. Your father believed distance would shield you from those conflicts." Mallory considered the explanation. "So he disappeared." "In a sense," Eleanor said, "but he never stopped watching." The sentence lingered. Mallory did not respond immediately. Instead, she reopened the folder and turned to the second page. There, written clearly within a legal trust structure, was her name, Mallory Westbrook, beneficiary. The document described a trust fund established years earlier, one designed to protect a portion of the Westbrook real estate holdings. And Mallory was its primary beneficiary. Mallory closed the folder again. The information did not produce the dramatic reaction Eleanor might have expected. Mallory's voice remained steady. "You came because of the divorce?" "Yes." Why, Eleanor's answer came quietly. "Because once the divorce becomes public, people will start looking more closely at you." Mallory leaned back slightly in her chair. "They already think I'm nothing," she said. Eleanor's expression softened. "That assumption has protected you." Mallory thought about Wayne Carter, about the settlement agreement waiting for her signature, about Lydia Monroe's growing place in Wayne's life. "Wayne doesn't know," Mallory said. "No," Eleanor replied. "And he should." Eleanor paused before answering. "That depends on what you want to do." Mallory looked toward the office room down the hallway. Inside that room sat years of records Wayne never realized existed. Emails, financial documents, timelines. The divorce agreement Wayne believed would quietly remove her from his life. Mallory returned her attention to Eleanor. "What exactly did my father ask you to do?" Eleanor closed the briefcase slowly. "He asked me to make sure you understood who you are before making any decisions." Mallory absorbed the words carefully. Who you are. For years, she had lived as the quiet wife of a rising developer who believed she brought little value to his world. Now she was learning that the name she rarely spoke aloud carried a weight Wayne had never imagined. Mallory stood and walked toward the office room. Eleanor followed quietly. When Mallory opened the laptop and revealed the organized folders on the screen, Eleanor's eyebrows lifted slightly. "You've been documenting," Eleanor said. Mallory nodded. "For months." Eleanor studied the files. Then she looked back at Mallory. "Your father always said you had your mother's patience." Mallory closed the laptop. And now she asked. Eleanor's voice remained calm. "Now you decide how patient you want to be." After Eleanor Pierce left the house that afternoon, the silence she left behind felt different from the quiet Mallory Westbrook had grown accustomed to. It was not uncertainty. It was clarity. For years, Mallory had lived without fully understanding the weight carried by her own last name. The documents Eleanor brought had not changed who Mallory was, but they had quietly adjusted the frame through which the world might eventually see her. More importantly, They confirmed something Mallory already sensed. She was not as alone as Wayne believed. Mallory spent the rest of the afternoon in the office room. The laptop screen glowed softly as she reopened the folders she had built over the past months. The files were already arranged chronologically, but now she began restructuring them with greater precision. She created a new folder. Legal preparation. Inside it, she copied several key files from the existing archives. Emails between Wayne and Lydia Monroe, hotel transaction records, consulting invoices submitted through Carter Development, the scanned divorce agreement. Mallory understood that documentation alone meant little unless it was organized in a way that could be clearly explained. Evidence she had learned from years of quiet observation was not simply about possessing information. It was about making patterns understandable. Later that evening, she called Daniel Harper. Daniel had once been recommended to her by an old colleague from Carter Development during a conversation years earlier. At the time, the introduction had seemed casual, just another contact in a professional network. But Daniel Harper had built a reputation as a meticulous attorney who specialized in corporate and marital financial disputes. When he answered the phone, his voice sounded calm and attentive. "Daniel Harper." "Mr. Harper," Mallory said. "This is Mallory Westbrook." There was a brief pause. Then Daniel responded carefully. "Yes, Mrs. Carter. How can I help you?" Mallory considered correcting the name immediately, but she decided it could wait. "I've been presented with a divorce agreement," she said. "I would like an independent review." Daniel's tone shifted slightly, becoming more focused. "Of course," he said. "Have you signed anything yet?" "No." "Good." Mallory heard the quiet approval in his voice. "When can you meet?" he asked. "Tomorrow morning," Mallory replied. They agreed to meet at Daniel's office near the Chicago River. That night, Wayne returned home later than usual. Mallory was sitting in the living room when he entered. He seemed relaxed, almost relieved. "Still reviewing the papers?" he asked casually. Mallory nodded. "Yes." Wayne loosened his tie and sat down across from her. "I don't want this to become complicated," he said. Mallory looked up from the folder in her hands. "Complicated for whom?" she asked. Wayne sighed softly. "For both of us." He leaned forward. "The agreement is fair, Mallory. It gives you financial stability without dragging things through court." Mallory studied him quietly. "You're confident of that?" Wayne nodded. "Yes." Mallory closed the folder. "I'll let you know my decision soon," she said. Wayne seemed satisfied with that answer. He stood and walked toward the kitchen. Mallory watched him disappear down the hallway. Then she returned to the office room. The work she began that night continued for several hours. She printed several documents. She highlighted certain dates. She built a detailed timeline, linking Wayne's email messages to specific financial transactions and meeting locations. Gradually, the pattern that once seemed uncertain became clearer. Wayne Carter had not simply grown distant from his marriage. He had been transferring financial resources in ways that might eventually raise questions during a divorce proceeding. Mallory did not jump to conclusions, but she documented the pattern carefully. The following morning, she arrived at Daniel Harper's office, carrying a neatly organized folder. Daniel greeted her personally in the reception area. He was younger than many attorneys Mallory had encountered in corporate meetings, mid-40s perhaps, but his calm demeanor suggested long experience with complicated disputes. They sat in a private conference room overlooking the river. Daniel opened the divorce agreement first. He read it slowly. Several minutes passed without interruption. Finally, he looked up. "This agreement favors your husband significantly," he said. Mallory nodded. "That was my impression." Daniel turned another page. "The non-disclosure clause is unusually broad," he added. "Yes." Daniel leaned back slightly. "Did your husband present this personally?" "Yes." "Along with his attorney?" Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "That suggests he expected quick compliance." Mallory placed another set of documents on the table. "These are records I've been keeping," she said. Daniel opened the folder. Inside were copies of emails, bank statements, consulting invoices, and timeline notes. He studied the material silently for several minutes. Mallory waited. Eventually, Daniel looked up again. "You've organized this yourself, yes?" Daniel tapped one of the pages lightly. "This timeline links financial transactions to hotel bookings and consulting invoices." Mallory nodded. "I noticed the pattern several months ago." Daniel turned another page. "And this email from your husband?" He read the sentence quietly. "Once everything is finalized, things will be simpler." Daniel placed the page back on the table. "Your husband may believe this divorce will remain private," he said carefully. Mallory met his eyes. "He expects that." Daniel considered the documents again. "Depending on how the financial records develop, this could become more complicated than he anticipates." Mallory remained calm. "I'm not interested in revenge," she said. Daniel studied her expression. "That's good," he replied, "because courts care about facts, not emotions." Mallory nodded. "That's why I kept records." Daniel smiled faintly. "Yes," he said, "I can see that." He closed the folder. "I'll need to review everything carefully," he said. "But based on what I see so far, I would strongly recommend not signing the agreement." Mallory expected that answer. "What happens next?" she asked. Daniel folded his hands on the table. "That depends on your objectives." Mallory thought for a moment. Then she spoke slowly. "I want the truth documented." Daniel nodded. "That's a reasonable goal." Mallory hesitated briefly before adding another detail. "There's something else you should know." Daniel waited. "My legal advisor from childhood visited yesterday." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Oh, Eleanor Pierce." Daniel's reaction was immediate. "I know the name." Mallory watched him carefully. "She represents the Westbrook family." Daniel's expression sharpened slightly. "Yes," he said. Mallory spoke the next sentence without raising her voice. "Richard Westbrook is my father." The room fell silent. Daniel looked at her for several seconds. Then he nodded slowly. "Well," he said quietly, "that certainly changes the landscape." Mallory did not react to the statement. She simply waited. Daniel leaned forward again. "If your husband doesn't know that yet," he said carefully, "he may have seriously underestimated the situation." Mallory's voice remained calm. "Yes." Daniel looked once more at the timeline spread across the table. "For now," he said, "we proceed methodically." Mallory nodded. Methodically. It was a word she understood well. Across Chicago that same morning, Wayne Carter arrived at his office, believing the next chapter of his life was already beginning. He believed the divorce agreement he had prepared would quietly resolve a complication. What he did not realize was that Mallory Westbrook had just begun working with people who understood something Wayne did not. The quietest person in the room was no longer standing alone. Wayne Carter had always believed that confidence solved most problems. Confidence attracted investors. It impressed city officials. It convinced people to trust promises about buildings that had not yet been constructed. For years, that confidence had carried him upward. Now, as the days passed after he delivered the divorce agreement to Mallory, Wayne moved through his life with the same assurance that the matter was already settled. He assumed Mallory would eventually sign. The silence between them did not trouble him. If anything, it reinforced his belief that she had accepted the situation quietly. Mallory continued living in the house, speaking politely during brief interactions, preparing simple dinners when their schedules overlapped. She did not argue. She did not demand explanations. Wayne interpreted this as resignation. What he did not see was that Mallory's silence had shifted. It was no longer the quiet patience of someone uncertain about what to do. It was the quiet focus of someone who had already begun preparing. Meanwhile, Wayne's relationship with Lydia Monroe became increasingly visible. Lydia now spent several days each week at Carter Development's office, working from a temporary desk in the conference area. Her presence felt natural to Wayne's team. She had charisma, confidence, and a talent for speaking persuasively about brand identity and public perception. Employees quickly adapted to her presence. Some even assumed she would eventually become a permanent executive within the company. Wayne did little to discourage that assumption. One afternoon, during a meeting with two potential investors from New York, Lydia sat beside Wayne at the conference table. She spoke smoothly about Carter Development's expansion strategy. "Chicago is only the beginning," Lydia explained. "Wayne has the vision to expand into multiple markets." The investors nodded approvingly. Wayne smiled. After the meeting ended, Lydia walked with Wayne back toward his office. "That went well," she said. Wayne leaned casually against the doorway. "You're good at this," he replied. Lydia laughed softly. "I told you, image matters." Wayne nodded. "And once the divorce is finalized, things will be even simpler." The words came easily. Too easily. Neither of them realized that the conversation had been overheard. At the far end of the hallway, one of Carter Development's junior project managers had paused while organizing files near the copy room. He did not hear every word, but he heard enough to understand the meaning. The information spread quietly through the office over the next few days. Employees began whispering about Wayne's impending divorce. Some of them noticed how comfortable Lydia had become in spaces once associated with Mallory. In another part of the city, Mallory continued working with Daniel Harper. Their meetings were calm and structured. Daniel had spent several days reviewing the records Mallory provided. The timeline she created had proven unusually detailed. One afternoon, they sat together in Daniel's conference room, reviewing additional financial data. Daniel pointed to a column of transactions on one of the printed bank statements. "These payments to Monroe Consulting Group," he said. Mallory nodded. "They began appearing more frequently 6 months ago." Daniel traced the dates with his pen, and several of them correspond with these hotel charges. Mallory slid another document toward him. "I cross-referenced those dates with Wayne's calendar entries." Daniel studied the sheet. "Investor meetings," he read aloud. Mallory remained quiet. Daniel leaned back in his chair. "Your husband may argue these were legitimate business expenses," he said. Mallory nodded. "That's possible." Daniel tapped the page again. "But if the pattern shows personal involvement with Lydia Monroe, while transferring company resources in unusual ways, the court will examine it closely." Mallory did not show satisfaction at the statement. She simply asked the next practical question. "What additional documentation would be useful?" Daniel smiled faintly. "You think like an investigator." Mallory shook her head. "No, I just keep records." Daniel reached for another file. "There's something else we should consider," he said. He opened an email printout from Wayne's account. Mallory recognized the message immediately. It was the same one she had discovered weeks earlier. "Once everything is finalized, things will be simpler." Daniel folded his hands. "If we establish that your husband was planning this divorce while financially entangled with Miss Monroe, the court may question whether assets were intentionally shifted before filing." Mallory understood the implication. Asset concealment during divorce proceedings could create serious legal consequences. Daniel studied her expression carefully. "You said earlier you're not interested in revenge. That's correct." "Good." He paused before continuing. "But it's important that the court understands the full context of the situation." Mallory nodded slowly. "Truth is enough," she said. Daniel closed the folder. "I believe it will be." Later that evening, Mallory returned home to find Wayne already there. He was sitting in the living room, scrolling through his phone. "Still working with that lawyer?" he asked casually when she entered. Mallory placed her coat on the chair. "Yes." Wayne shrugged. "That's your right." His tone suggested a mild annoyance, but not concern. "I still think you'll realize the agreement is reasonable," he added. Mallory sat across from him. "I'm reviewing everything carefully." Wayne nodded. "That's fine." He glanced at his phone again. Mallory watched him quietly. Then she asked a simple question. "Have you already told Lydia about the divorce?" Wayne looked up quickly. "Why would you ask that?" Mallory held his gaze. "I was curious." Wayne hesitated for a moment. Then he answered, "She knows we're separating." Mallory nodded. "That must make things simpler." Wayne did not respond immediately. Instead, he leaned back in his chair. "Mallory," he said, "there's no reason to drag this out." Mallory's voice remained calm. "I'm not dragging anything out." Wayne sighed. "Then what are you doing?" Mallory looked at him for several seconds. "I'm understanding what happened." Wayne frowned slightly. "There's nothing complicated about it." Mallory did not argue. But after Wayne left the room, she walked once again into the office. The laptop screen illuminated the familiar folders: Monroe, divorce, legal preparation. She added another entry to the timeline: conversation. Wayne confirms Lydia aware of divorce plan. Mallory saved the document. Across the city, Wayne Carter still believed he was moving confidently toward a future that excluded the quiet woman he once married. But every word he spoke now carried weight. Every careless comment, every transaction, every assumption that Mallory would remain silent. And slowly, patiently, the record of those assumptions continued to grow. By the time the second week passed after Wayne Carter presented the divorce agreement, the tension inside the Carter family had shifted from quiet expectation to open pressure. Wayne had assumed Mallory would sign within a few days. When she did not, his mother began asking questions. Margaret Carter believed strongly in resolving problems quickly, particularly problems that might interfere with the public image of her family. She had spent years cultivating relationships among Chicago's social and business circles, and the idea of a drawn-out divorce felt to her like a threat to the reputation Wayne had worked so hard to build. On a Sunday afternoon, she called Mallory directly. "Mallory," Margaret said over the phone, her voice smooth but firm. "We should talk." Mallory listened quietly. Margaret continued, "This situation between you and Wayne is becoming unnecessary." Mallory understood the meaning immediately. "I'm reviewing the agreement," she replied. Margaret sighed softly. "There isn't much to review." Mallory did not respond. Margaret's tone hardened slightly. "Dragging this into court would help no one," she said. "Especially you." Mallory noticed the careful emphasis on the final words. "I see," she said. Margaret continued speaking with a calm authority that suggested she believed the conversation would end in agreement. "Wayne has offered a fair settlement," she said. "You'll be able to live comfortably." Mallory sat quietly at the kitchen table, the phone resting against her ear. Margaret added one final sentence: "You should consider what your life will look like if this becomes public." Mallory answered gently, "I already have." Margaret paused. "Well," she said finally, "I hope you make the sensible decision." The call ended shortly after. Mallory placed the phone down slowly. She did not appear shaken. Instead, she opened her laptop and added another entry to her timeline. Phone call: Margaret Carter urging immediate signature of divorce agreement. Then she returned to reviewing financial records. Later that evening, Wayne arrived home earlier than usual. He seemed irritated. "I spoke with my mother," he said while loosening his tie. Mallory nodded. "I assumed you might." Wayne walked into the kitchen and poured himself a drink. "She thinks this situation is dragging on longer than it needs to." Mallory looked up. "And you," Wayne took a sip before answering. "I agree." Mallory closed the folder she had been reviewing. "You're in a hurry." Wayne set the glass down on the counter. "I'm trying to move forward." Mallory studied him. With Lydia, Wayne did not answer immediately. The silence itself provided the answer. "Yes," he said finally. Mallory nodded. "That explains the urgency." Wayne's patience thinned. "This isn't about Lydia." Mallory said nothing. Wayne continued speaking. "It's about practicality." Mallory's voice remained calm. "You want a clean transition?" Wayne nodded. "Exactly." Mallory stood and walked toward the office room. Wayne watched her go, but did not follow. Inside the office, Mallory updated her timeline again. Wayne confirms desire to move forward. She closed the file and leaned back in her chair. The pattern had become unmistakable now. Across the city, Carter Development continued operating as if nothing had changed. Wayne attended meetings with investors. Lydia Monroe continued working from the office several days each week. Among the employees, however, the rumors had grown louder. Several staff members had noticed that Lydia now attended strategy meetings that once included Mallory in earlier years. Others observed how Wayne often left the office with Lydia late in the evening. No one spoke openly about it, but the atmosphere inside the company had shifted. One evening, after a long meeting with contractors, Wayne invited Lydia to dinner at a restaurant overlooking the Chicago River. The restaurant was quiet, the lighting low and elegant. Lydia leaned back in her chair as the waiter poured wine. So she said, "Have you heard anything from Mallory yet?" Wayne shook his head. "She's reviewing the agreement with a lawyer." Lydia raised an eyebrow. "A lawyer?" Wayne shrugged. "That's normal." Lydia studied him carefully. "Do you think she'll fight it?" Wayne laughed softly. "No." His confidence remained unshaken. "Mallory doesn't fight." Lydia took a sip of wine. "Still, she said some people surprise you." Wayne shook his head again. "You don't know her." Across town, Mallory was sitting with Daniel Harper in his office. They'd spent the afternoon reviewing additional financial disclosures that Daniel had requested from Carter Development's legal team. Daniel placed several documents on the table. "These came from Whitman's office this morning," he said. Mallory looked down at them. The documents included preliminary financial summaries Wayne's attorney had submitted as part of the divorce negotiation. Mallory studied the numbers carefully. Several items immediately caught her attention. These accounts weren't listed in the earlier documents, she said. Daniel nodded. "Correct." Mallory traced one entry with her finger. "Consulting expenses," she read. Daniel watched her expression. "Yes," Mallory looked up. "These payments increased significantly over the last 6 months." Daniel nodded again. "Which aligns with the timeline you created." Mallory sat back in her chair. Daniel folded his hands. "The court will require full disclosure if the divorce proceeds formally," he said. Mallory nodded. "That's good." Daniel studied her carefully. "You're handling this very calmly." Mallory considered the observation. "I prefer facts." Daniel smiled slightly. "That's fortunate." He leaned forward. "Because facts are starting to accumulate." Mallory gathered the papers neatly. Daniel continued speaking. "There's one more matter we should discuss." Mallory looked up. "If your identity as Richard Westbrook's daughter becomes known during these proceedings," he said carefully, "the dynamics of this case will change dramatically." Mallory remained quiet. Daniel continued. "Your husband may not yet understand who he's negotiating with." Mallory thought for a moment. "That might not matter." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Why not?" Mallory answered calmly. "Because the truth will speak for itself." Daniel leaned back in his chair. "Yes," he said, "it usually does." That night, Mallory returned home and found Wayne sitting alone in the living room. He looked up when she entered. "Still working with that lawyer?" he asked. Mallory nodded. "Yes." Wayne sighed. "I don't understand why you're making this harder than it needs to be." Mallory stood quietly for a moment. Then she said something that caused Wayne to pause. "I'm not making it harder." Wayne frowned. "Then what are you doing?" Mallory met his eyes. "I'm making it clear." Wayne stared at her, unsure what she meant. But before he could ask further questions, Mallory turned and walked down the hallway toward the office room. The door closed softly behind her. Inside, she opened the laptop once more. The timeline continued to grow. Every conversation, every financial entry, every assumption Wayne Carter made about her silence. Each one carefully documented. And with each new line added to the record, the distance between what Wayne believed and what was actually unfolding grew wider. The first formal legal meeting was scheduled for a quiet Wednesday morning in a downtown conference suite overlooking the Chicago River. In legal terms, it was described as a preliminary settlement conference. A routine step intended to allow both parties to clarify financial disclosures and discuss whether the divorce could be resolved without court litigation. Wayne Carter arrived 10 minutes early. He believed punctuality conveyed control. His attorney, Greg Whitman, was already seated at the conference table, reviewing a folder of documents. Whitman looked up when Wayne entered and offered a brief nod. "Morning," Whitman said. Wayne loosened his coat and sat across from him. "Anything I should expect today?" Wayne asked. Whitman adjusted his glasses. "Your wife retained counsel." Wayne shrugged. "That's normal." Whitman paused slightly before continuing. "The attorney is Daniel Harper." Wayne considered the name. "I've heard of him," he said. Whitman nodded. "He's competent." Wayne leaned back in his chair. "That's fine," he replied confidently. "There's nothing to argue about." Whitman did not respond immediately. Instead, he continued reviewing the documents in front of him. Wayne interpreted the silence as agreement. A few minutes later, the conference room door opened. Mallory entered first. She wore a simple dark suit, her hair tied neatly back, her expression calm. Behind her walked Daniel Harper. Wayne noticed immediately that Daniel carried several organized folders under his arm. Mallory greeted the room politely. "Good morning." Wayne nodded. Greg Whitman stood briefly as Daniel approached. "Daniel Whitman," said. Greg Daniel replied. The two attorneys shook hands with the professional courtesy of men who had crossed paths in Chicago's legal community before. Everyone took their seats. For a moment, the room was quiet, except for the soft sound of papers being arranged. Whitman spoke first. "As you know, Mr. Carter has proposed a settlement agreement intended to resolve the divorce efficiently." Daniel nodded. "We've reviewed the document." Whitman looked toward Mallory. "Has your client reached a decision?" Daniel glanced briefly at Mallory before answering. "We have several questions regarding financial disclosures." Wayne shifted slightly in his chair. Whitman opened a folder. "All required information has been provided." Daniel slid a document across the table. "This statement lists consulting payments made by Carter Development to Monroe Consulting Group over the last 12 months. Whitman looked down at the page. "Yes," Daniel continued. "We noticed a significant increase in payments beginning approximately 6 months ago." Wayne spoke before Whitman could respond. "That's when we expanded our marketing strategy." Daniel nodded calmly. "That's consistent with the explanation provided." Mallory remained silent. Daniel placed another document beside the first. This second document lists hotel charges submitted as reimbursable business expenses. Whitman glanced at Wayne briefly before examining the page. Daniel continued speaking in the same measured tone. Many of these dates correspond with the consulting invoices. Wayne leaned forward slightly. "That's because meetings took place there." Daniel nodded again. "That may be the case." Mallory watched the exchange quietly. Daniel then opened another folder. "This email was sent from Mr. Carter's account on April 18th. He read the line aloud. "Once everything is finalized, things will be simpler." Wayne shifted in his chair. Whitman raised a hand slightly. "Daniel?" He said carefully, "We're not here to interpret private correspondence." Daniel remained calm. "Of course." He closed the folder. "Our objective today is simply to clarify financial transparency before further negotiation." Whitman nodded slowly. "That's reasonable." Wayne watched the conversation unfold with mild impatience. To him, the discussion felt unnecessary. The evidence Daniel presented seemed circumstantial at best. Nothing suggested wrongdoing. Nothing threatened the divorce agreement Wayne had already prepared. But Daniel had not finished. He placed another document on the table. "This timeline was compiled by my client." Whitman looked down at the sheet. The document contained a detailed chronological list. Consulting invoices, hotel expenses, calendar entries labeled investor meetings, email timestamps. Whitman read the page carefully. Wayne glanced at it briefly, then leaned back again. "It's speculation," Wayne said. Daniel responded calmly. "It's documentation." Whitman set the paper down slowly. "This information can be reviewed further if necessary." Daniel nodded. That's all we're requesting." The room fell quiet again. Mallory had not spoken a single word since entering the conference room. Wayne finally turned toward her. "You've been keeping records?" he asked. Mallory met his gaze. "Yes." Wayne frowned slightly. "Why?" Mallory answered simply. "Because details matter." Wayne shook his head. "You're overthinking this." Daniel intervened gently. "Mr. Carter, documentation is common in financial matters." Whitman cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should refocus on settlement terms." Daniel folded his hands. "We're open to discussing them?" Whitman nodded. "Good." Wayne leaned forward. "I want this resolved quickly." Mallory looked at him. "So do I." Wayne seemed relieved to hear that. Whitman turned to Daniel. "Then we can finalize the agreement with minor adjustments." Daniel did not answer immediately. Instead, he said something that caused Wayne to pause. "That may depend on additional financial disclosures." Whitman looked at him carefully. What additional disclosures? Daniel opened one final folder. "Several accounts listed in the preliminary financial statement appear incomplete." Whitman glanced at Wayne again. Wayne frowned. "What accounts?" Daniel slid another sheet across the table. "These consulting expense reimbursements." Whitman read the document slowly. Wayne's confidence dimmed slightly for the first time. Daniel continued. "We're requesting a complete financial accounting before proceeding." Whitman nodded reluctantly. "That's standard procedure if negotiations continue." Wayne exhaled quietly. To him, the meeting had become unnecessarily technical. Still, nothing presented so far seemed truly threatening. The meeting concluded an hour later. Both attorneys agreed to exchange additional financial documents within the next week. As everyone stood to leave, Wayne approached Mallory. "You didn't need to do all that," he said quietly. Mallory looked at him calmly. "I didn't do anything." Wayne gestured toward the folders. "You're making this complicated." Mallory shook her head slightly. "No." Wayne frowned. "Then what are you doing?" Mallory answered with the same steady tone she had used throughout the meeting. "I'm making sure everything is accurate." Wayne watched her walk toward the door beside Daniel Harper. For the first time since he proposed the divorce, a faint uncertainty appeared in his expression. It disappeared quickly. Wayne still believed the situation remained under control. Across the river that afternoon, Daniel Harper turned to Mallory as they exited the building. "You handled that well," he said. Mallory nodded. "They're confident." Daniel smiled slightly. "Yes." He paused before adding quietly, "That usually changes once the evidence becomes clearer." Mallory looked out toward the skyline of Chicago. The city stood tall around them, built from decades of ambition, risk, and careful planning. Some of those buildings carried a name few people spoke casually. Westbrook. Mallory said nothing about that name yet. But the moment when it would matter was drawing closer. The week following the preliminary settlement conference passed with a different tone on both sides of the divorce. For the first time since Wayne Carter proposed the agreement, the process had slowed. Requests for additional financial disclosures moved back and forth between the attorneys. Emails from Greg Whitman's office arrived regularly, often late in the evening. Daniel Harper responded carefully to each one, asking for clarifications and supplemental records. From Wayne's perspective, the process had become unnecessarily technical. He had expected a straightforward negotiation. Instead, the documentation requests seemed to multiply. Still, he remained confident. None of the information Daniel Harper had raised during the meeting appeared strong enough to threaten the settlement Wayne had already prepared. At worst, the negotiations might adjust the financial terms slightly. Wayne believed he could absorb that. What he did not know was that the dynamic around the case had quietly begun shifting outside the conference rooms. One afternoon, Daniel Harper received a call in his office. The caller introduced herself simply. Eleanor Pierce. Daniel sat up slightly in his chair. "I'm familiar with your name," he said. Eleanor's voice carried calm authority. "I understand you're representing Mallory." That's correct. Eleanor paused briefly before continuing. I thought it would be useful for us to speak. They agreed to meet the following morning. When Eleanor arrived at Daniel's office, she carried the same leather briefcase she had brought to Mallory's home days earlier. Daniel greeted her respectfully. In Chicago's legal circles, Eleanor Pierce's reputation was well known. She had spent decades managing legal affairs for one of the most powerful real estate families in the country. After they sat down, Eleanor opened her briefcase. I'm not here to interfere with your case, she said calmly. Daniel nodded. Then why are you here? Eleanor placed a document on the table. It was not related to the divorce directly. Instead, it displayed the corporate structure of Westbrook Holdings. Daniel studied the page carefully. I assume you know this company, Eleanor said. Daniel nodded slowly. Yes. Westbrook Holdings had been involved in some of the largest commercial property developments in Chicago over the past 20 years. The company rarely appeared publicly in media coverage, but its influence within the real estate industry was widely understood. Eleanor slid another document forward. This one contained a legal trust structure. Daniel read the beneficiary name, printed clearly near the top, Mallory Westbrook. Daniel looked up. I see. Eleanor folded her hands. Mallory asked me to inform you. Daniel leaned back slightly. And Mr. Carter doesn't know. No. Daniel considered the situation for several seconds. That will change the context of the divorce significantly. Eleanor nodded. Yes. Daniel studied the documents again. Does Mr. Westbrook intend to become involved? Eleanor shook her head. Not unless necessary. Daniel smiled faintly. That's a very Westbrook answer. Eleanor allowed herself a small smile. Yes. Meanwhile, across the city, Wayne Carter was meeting Lydia Monroe for lunch near the river. The restaurant overlooked a construction site where steel beams were rising slowly into the sky. Wayne pointed toward the structure as they sat down. That project will be finished next year, he said proudly. Lydia followed his gaze. It's impressive. Wayne smiled. Carter Development is moving into a different league now. Lydia leaned forward slightly. And the divorce, Wayne shrugged. It's moving along. Mallory signed, yet not yet. Lydia raised an eyebrow. That's surprising. Wayne laughed lightly. She's reviewing it with a lawyer. Lydia stirred her coffee. You seem very calm about that. Wayne nodded. There's nothing she can really challenge. He paused before adding, Mallory doesn't have the resources for a long legal fight. Lydia nodded slowly. That makes things easier. Wayne looked relaxed again. Yes. Later that afternoon, Daniel Harper met with Mallory in his office. The skyline outside the window reflected against the glass walls of the conference room. Daniel placed the Westbrook documents on the table between them. I spoke with Eleanor Pierce this morning, he said. Mallory nodded. I assumed you might. Daniel tapped the page with a trust structure. Your father's holdings are significant. Mallory did not appear surprised. Daniel continued, if this becomes known during the divorce proceedings, Wayne Carter's legal strategy will collapse. Mallory looked at the papers quietly. That's not my goal. Daniel watched her carefully. What is your goal? Mallory answered without hesitation. Accuracy. Daniel smiled slightly. You're very consistent. Mallory did not respond. Daniel continued. For now, I recommend we keep this information confidential. Mallory nodded. That's fine. Daniel leaned back in his chair. But we should be prepared for the moment when it becomes relevant. Mallory folded her hands on the table. When would that be? Daniel considered the question. When Wayne's legal team attempts to frame you as financially dependent. Mallory nodded slowly. That's likely. Daniel closed the folder. When that happens, the court will learn something very different. Later that evening, Wayne returned home in an unusually good mood. Mallory was sitting in the living room reading. Good news, Wayne said casually. What kind? The lawyers are exchanging documents. Wayne replied. This should wrap up soon. Mallory looked up. You're confident? Wayne nodded. Yes. Mallory closed her book. And if it doesn't? Wayne shrugged. Then it takes a little longer. Mallory studied him quietly. Wayne noticed the expression and frowned slightly. What? Mallory shook her head. Nothing. Wayne leaned against the door frame. You know, he said this will be better for both of us. Mallory said nothing. Wayne continued. You'll be able to start fresh. Mallory's voice remained calm. So will you? Wayne nodded. Yes. He walked upstairs shortly after. Mallory remained in the living room. Several minutes later, she returned to the office room. Her laptop screen illuminated the familiar folders. Monroe, divorce, legal preparation. Now there was another document waiting in her files. The trust structure Daniel had shown her earlier. Mallory added it to the archive, but placed it in a separate folder. She labeled it simply Westbrook. For years, the name had remained quietly in the background of her life. Wayne Carter had built his plans around the assumption that Mallory stood alone. That assumption would not survive much longer. But Mallory still said nothing, not yet. The next legal meeting was not scheduled as a formal hearing. It was meant to be another document review session and one more step in the slow negotiation process that Wayne Carter still believed would eventually end with Mallory signing the agreement. Yet from the moment the meeting began, the tone in the conference room felt different. Greg Whitman arrived first, carrying a thicker set of financial disclosures than before. Wayne followed several minutes later, appearing confident but slightly impatient. Across the table, Daniel Harper had already arranged several organized folders. Mallory sat beside him, quietly, her posture composed, her expression unchanged. For a moment, no one spoke. Whitman opened the discussion. We've provided the additional financial records your office requested, he said, sliding a stack of documents toward Daniel. Daniel nodded. Thank you. He began reviewing them methodically. The room remained quiet, except for the soft rustle of paper. Wayne leaned back in his chair. How long do we expect this to take? He asked. Whitman glanced briefly at him. That depends on what questions arise. Wayne exhaled quietly. Mallory watched the exchange without speaking. Daniel continued reading through the financial disclosures. Several minutes passed before he placed one page aside. This document lists consulting payments made to Monroe Consulting Group, he said. Whitman nodded. Yes. Daniel slid another document forward. And these hotel reimbursements correspond with several of those same dates. Wayne spoke before Whitman could answer. We've already discussed that. Daniel remained calm. Yes, he opened another folder. But we now have additional information. Wayne frowned slightly. What information? Daniel turned one of the pages toward Whitman. This email chain between Mr. Carter and Miss Monroe references several meetings that were described in company records as investor consultations. Whitman read the page carefully. Wayne shifted in his chair. They were strategy meetings. Daniel nodded. That may be true. He turned another page. But the financial records indicate the meetings were billed to Carter Development as consulting expenses. Whitman remained silent. Daniel continued. The court typically examines such patterns closely when financial disclosures overlap with personal relationships. Wayne leaned forward. This is speculation. Daniel's tone remained steady. It's documentation. Mallory remained silent beside him. Daniel then opened a final folder. Inside were several printed pages of email exchanges. One message stood out clearly. Daniel read it aloud. Once everything is finalized, things will be simpler. Wayne's expression tightened slightly. Whitman spoke carefully. Again, private correspondence does not necessarily indicate wrongdoing. Daniel nodded. That's correct. He slid another document across the table. But combined with financial transfers and timeline alignment, it raises legitimate questions. Whitman reviewed the page. Wayne glanced toward Mallory. You've been collecting all this? He asked. Mallory answered calmly. Yes. Wayne shook his head. You didn't trust me. Mallory met his eyes. I recorded what happened. Wayne looked away. Daniel continued the discussion. We are requesting clarification regarding the classification of these consulting expenses. Whitman sighed quietly. We can review those charges again. Daniel nodded. Thank you. The discussion continued for nearly an hour. Most of it focused on financial documentation, transaction dates, and accounting categories. Gradually, the confidence Wayne carried into the meeting began to soften. Not dramatically, but enough for small signs of irritation to appear. He tapped his fingers against the table. He checked his phone more frequently. Finally, he turned toward Mallory again. You're trying to turn this into something bigger than it is, he said. Mallory remained calm. I'm asking for clarity. Wayne leaned back again. This is a divorce, not a criminal investigation. Daniel answered before Mallory did. Divorce proceedings require financial transparency. Wayne frowned. This could have been simple. Mallory spoke quietly. It still can be. Wayne studied her. Then why aren't you signing the agreement? Mallory held his gaze. Because the agreement assumes something that isn't accurate? Wayne frowned. What assumption? Mallory did not answer immediately. Daniel closed one of the folders. The assumption that Mrs. Carter is financially dependent. Whitman looked up sharply. Wayne turned toward Daniel. What does that mean? Daniel glanced briefly at Mallory. She nodded slightly. Daniel reached into another folder and removed a document. He placed it carefully on the table. Whitman looked down at it first. His eyebrows lifted slightly. Wayne leaned forward. What is that? Whitman read the heading quietly. Westbrook Holdings Trust Structure. The name seemed to linger in the room. Wayne frowned. What does that have to do with this case? Daniel answered calmly. It establishes financial independence. Wayne looked from Daniel to Mallory. Westbrook Mallory spoke for the first time in several minutes. It's my family name. Wayne stared at her. You never mentioned that. Mallory's voice remained steady. You never asked. Whitman continued reading the document carefully. Daniel spoke again. The trust identifies Mallory Westbrook as the primary beneficiary. Wayne's confusion deepened. What trust? Mallory answered quietly. My father established it. Wayne shook his head. Your father, Daniel, added the final detail. Richard Westbrook. For several seconds, no one spoke. Whitman slowly placed the document down. Wayne stared at Mallory. Richard Westbrook. The developer? Mallory nodded once. Yes. The room fell silent again. Wayne leaned back slowly in his chair. His expression changed not dramatically, but enough for the shift to become visible. The name Westbrook carried weight in Chicago's real estate industry. Wayne knew it well. Every developer in the city did. Westbrook Holdings had financed projects that shaped entire districts. Wayne had spent years trying to compete in markets where Westbrook investments quietly influenced outcomes. And now he was learning that the quiet woman he had tried to remove from his life carried that name. Whitman cleared his throat. This changes the financial framework of the settlement, he said. Daniel nodded. Yes. Wayne looked at Mallory again. You're serious? Mallory met his gaze. Yes. Wayne sat silently for several seconds. Finally, he asked the only question that seemed to matter to him in that moment. Why didn't you tell me? Mallory's answer came softly. Because it never mattered to me. The meeting ended shortly afterward. Both attorneys agreed to pause settlement negotiations while reviewing the new financial disclosures. As Wayne left the conference room, he glanced once more at Mallory. For the first time since their marriage began falling apart, the certainty he once carried had faded. Across the table, Mallory gathered her documents quietly. She did not look triumphant. She did not speak another word. The truth had simply entered the room. And now it would remain there. After the meeting where the name Westbrook first entered the room, the atmosphere around the divorce changed completely. Until that moment, Wayne Carter had approached the process with the quiet certainty of someone who believed he controlled the outcome. The settlement agreement he prepared had assumed a simple equation. He held the wealth, the company, and the public reputation, while Mallory had little leverage to challenge him. Now the equation had shifted. Not because Mallory had threatened him, not because she had argued, but because the facts had changed the structure of the conversation. Within days, the legal tone surrounding the case grew noticeably more formal. Greg Whitman requested time to review the Westbrook Trust documentation. Additional financial disclosures were submitted to Daniel Harper's office. The language in the correspondence between the attorneys became more careful, more precise. What had once been a straightforward settlement discussion now resembled a full financial examination. Wayne noticed the difference immediately. The first sign came during a meeting with Whitman 2 days after the conference, where Mallory's family name was revealed. They sat together in Whitman's office overlooking LaSalle Street. Wayne leaned forward in his chair. "You knew about this?" he asked. Whitman shook his head. "No." Wayne exhaled sharply. "How does someone marry into the Westbrook family without anyone knowing?" Whitman spoke carefully, because Mallory never presented herself that way. Wayne leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "This doesn't make sense." Whitman folded his hands on the desk. "Actually, it does." Wayne looked at him. "Explain." Whitman gestured toward the documents spread across the desk. "Westbrook Holdings is privately controlled. They rarely appear publicly in family matters." Wayne frowned. "So what does this mean for the divorce?" Whitman answered calmly. "It means your assumption that Mallory is financially dependent is no longer accurate." Wayne shook his head. "I wasn't trying to take advantage of her." Whitman did not respond to that statement. Instead, he added another point. "And if the court examines financial transparency more closely, the timeline of your consulting payments and reimbursements may receive additional scrutiny." Wayne understood the implication. The documentation Mallory had collected, emails, hotel records, consulting invoices, now carried more weight than he originally believed. Not because it proved wrongdoing by itself, but because the case had become more visible. Wayne stood and walked toward the window. Outside, the business district moved normally below him. People walked to meetings. Construction cranes moved slowly above half-finished buildings. Everything looked unchanged. Yet Wayne could feel the shift. Meanwhile, Mallory continued living quietly in the house they still shared. She did not speak about the meeting. She did not ask Wayne what he had learned afterward. Instead, she continued working with Daniel Harper. Several days later, Daniel invited her to his office again. They sat together reviewing the next phase of the case. Daniel placed several documents on the table. "These are revised financial statements submitted by Whitman's office." Mallory read through them carefully. Daniel watched her expression. "They're being more cautious now," he said. Mallory nodded. "Yes." Daniel leaned back slightly. "The Westbrook connection changed their strategy." Mallory closed the folder. "I expected that." Daniel studied her. "You don't seem surprised by any of this." Mallory considered the observation. People behave predictably when they realize they misunderstood a situation. Daniel smiled faintly. That's one way to describe it. He turned to another document. "The court may still schedule a formal hearing if the settlement isn't finalized soon." Mallory nodded. "That's fine." Daniel paused before asking the question that mattered most. "What outcome are you comfortable with?" Mallory answered without hesitation. "A fair conclusion." Daniel nodded slowly. "I believe we're approaching that." Across town, Wayne Carter faced a different reality. In the days following the revelation about Mallory's family, his professional life had begun to feel slightly unsettled. Not publicly, but quietly. One afternoon, Wayne attended a meeting with 2 investors who had previously expressed interest in partnering with Carter Development on a new project. The conversation started normally. They discussed construction timelines, zoning approvals, and financing structures. But midway through the meeting, one of the investors asked a question that felt unexpected. Is it true your wife is connected to Westbrook Holdings? Wayne paused. The investor continued. We heard something about it through legal channels. Wayne forced a calm expression. It's a personal matter, he said. The investor nodded politely. Of course. But the question lingered in the room. After the meeting ended, Wayne sat alone in his office for several minutes. The divorce was no longer a private transition. It had become a subject of quiet curiosity. That evening, Wayne returned home earlier than usual. Mallory was in the living room reading. He stood near the doorway for a moment before speaking. Why didn't you tell me about your father? Mallory closed the book. You never asked. Wayne shook his head. That's not the point. Mallory looked at him calmly. Then what is? Wayne struggled briefly to find the words. You made it seem like you had nothing. Mallory considered the statement. I never said that. Wayne sighed. You let me believe it. Mallory's voice remained quiet. You believed what you wanted. Wayne looked away. For the first time in their long marriage, he seemed uncertain how to continue the conversation. Finally, less decisively, he asked another question. Are you trying to ruin me? Mallory answered immediately. No. Wayne looked at her again. Then why all the documentation? Mallory met his eyes. Because the truth deserves to be recorded. Wayne said nothing more. He turned and walked upstairs. Later that night, Mallory returned to the office room once again. Her laptop screen illuminated the folders that now contained the complete record of the past several months. Monroe, divorce, legal preparation, Westbrook. Mallory reviewed the timeline one more time. Every email, every financial entry, every conversation. All of it documented carefully. Not as a weapon, not as revenge. Simply as a record of what had happened. And now the process was nearing its conclusion. Soon the court, or the final settlement, would close the case. Mallory shut the laptop gently. Across the city, Wayne Carter was beginning to understand something he had never considered before. The quiet woman he believed he could easily remove from his life had never been powerless. She had simply chosen silence. And silence, when combined with patience and truth, could become something far stronger than he had ever imagined. The final stage of the divorce arrived without spectacle. There were no raised voices, no dramatic confrontations in crowded hallways. No attempts by either side to transform the proceedings into a public battle. Instead, the conclusion unfolded the same way most legal matters eventually do, through document signatures and quiet acknowledgement that a story had reached its end. Several weeks after the Westbrook name entered the case, both legal teams agreed to finalize the settlement. The agreement that now lay on the conference table looked very different from the one Wayne Carter had originally placed in front of Mallory. The revised document reflected a clearer financial picture. The non-disclosure clause had been narrowed significantly. The asset disclosures had been expanded and corrected. Most importantly, the assumption that Mallory depended on Wayne's resources no longer appeared anywhere in the text. Instead, the document described the divorce in neutral language, two individuals separating their lives, property, and obligations with legal clarity. The final signing took place in a quiet conference room inside Daniel Harper's office. Mallory arrived first. She wore the same understated style she had maintained throughout the entire process. A simple dark suit, minimal jewelry, her hair neatly tied back. Her expression showed no excitement, no relief, no visible emotion beyond calm attention. Daniel sat beside her, reviewing the final document. Everything here reflects the revisions we discussed, he said. Mallory read through the pages carefully. Across the table, Greg Whitman reviewed the same document with Wayne Carter. Wayne looked different from the man who had once slid divorce papers across a ballroom table weeks earlier. The confidence he usually carried had softened. Not completely, but enough for small hesitations to appear in his movements. When Whitman finished reading, he closed the folder. This agreement resolves all financial and legal matters, he said. Daniel nodded. Yes. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Whitman placed a pen on the table. If everyone is satisfied, we can sign. Wayne picked up the pen first. He looked briefly toward Mallory. She met his gaze calmly. There was no hostility in her expression, no accusation, just quiet acknowledgement of the moment. Wayne signed his name. The sound of the pen moving across the paper felt louder than expected in the silent room. He slid the document toward Mallory. Mallory took the pen. For several seconds, she read the final paragraph again. Not because she doubted the terms, but because she understood that this line of ink would close an entire chapter of her life. Then she signed. The marriage between Mallory Westbrook and Wayne Carter ended in that quiet moment. No one applauded. No one spoke. The attorneys exchanged brief professional nods as the documents were collected and placed into folders. The legal conclusion had been reached. Afterward, the four of them stood slowly from the table. Whitman turned to Daniel. We'll file the documents this afternoon. Daniel nodded. Thank you. Wayne remained near the table, unsure whether to leave immediately. Mallory gathered her folder and stood. For a moment, Wayne looked as if he might say something. Finally, he did. I never expected any of this. Mallory studied him for a moment. You expected something simpler, she said. Wayne nodded quietly. Yes. Mallory did not argue. Instead, she asked one final question. Do you understand why I kept records? Wayne hesitated before answering. I think I do. Mallory nodded once. That's enough. Wayne looked as though he wanted to continue the conversation, but the words did not come. Daniel opened the door for Mallory. She stepped into the hallway. The afternoon light from the large windows illuminated the corridor. Outside, Chicago moved through its usual rhythm cars, passing along the river office workers heading toward meetings, construction cranes moving slowly above the skyline. Life had not paused for the end of her marriage. Mallory walked toward the elevator with steady steps. Daniel joined her a moment later. You handled that well, he said. Mallory nodded. It was straightforward. Daniel smiled slightly. Not many divorces end that calmly. Mallory pressed the elevator button. Most people are still trying to prove something. The elevator doors opened. As they stepped inside, Daniel glanced at her. Do you feel relieved? Mallory thought for a moment before answering. I feel finished. Daniel nodded. That's sometimes better than relief. When the elevator reached the ground floor, Mallory stepped outside into the cool afternoon air. She paused briefly on the sidewalk. Across the street, glass towers reflected sunlight against the Chicago River. Some of those buildings carried names that had become symbols of ambition in the real estate world. Carter Development had tried to join that list. Westbrook Holdings had shaped it long before Wayne Carter began building. Mallory did not look at those buildings with pride. She simply acknowledged their presence. Later that evening, she returned to the house she and Wayne had once shared. The rooms were quieter now. Wayne had already begun making arrangements to move into a new apartment downtown. Several boxes stood stacked near the front door. Mallory walked past them and entered the office room. The laptop still sat on the desk where she had spent so many nights documenting the past months. She opened it one final time. The familiar folders appeared on the screen. Monroe, divorce, legal preparation, Westbrook. Mallory opened the timeline document. At the bottom of the page, she added one final entry. Divorce finalized. She saved the file. Then she closed the laptop. For the first time in many months, there was nothing more to document. The story had already recorded itself. Mallory stood and looked around the room one last time. Soon she would leave this house. Soon she would begin deciding what the next chapter of her life might look like. Not as Wayne Carter's wife, not as someone hidden quietly behind another person's ambition, but simply as Mallory Westbrook. She turned off the light and walked out with the same quiet dignity she had carried through every moment of the story. In stories like this, the most powerful moments rarely arrive with loud triumph. Mallory never shouted, never tried to humiliate the man who had once humiliated her, never used her family name as a weapon. Instead, she did something far quieter and far stronger. She observed. She recorded. She allowed the truth to stand on its own. Wayne Carter believed confidence would always control the outcome. But confidence without awareness can become blindness. And blindness in matters of trust and respect often reveals itself too late. What remained at the end of this story was not revenge, but clarity. Two people walked away from a marriage with very different lessons. One learned that silence does not mean weakness. The other learned that the quietest person in the room may understand far more than anyone realizes. If this story made you pause and reflect even for a moment, feel free to share where you're watching from and what time it is there. Stories travel farther than we expect, and it's always meaningful to see how many places they reach. And if you enjoy stories about quiet strength, justice, and the moments when truth slowly comes into the light, you're welcome to like the video or subscribe to the channel. There are many more stories still waiting to be told.